Hello, greetings, Rose, Diana. Good morning to you in Melbourne.
The panel was about data science.
Hey, Salim.
Hello, Rose.
Hi.
Uh,
Yeah,
Thank you for joining. So we will be recording this as well, and we'll be putting it on our YouTube channel. So it will have a much longer life than just our audience here. And so we are really thrilled that both of you were able to join because the topic, once I saw your two books, I thought this is great to get the conversation between two splendid authors. I don't know if you have either of you have met each other before or no. No.
Yeah, thank you for bringing us together.
Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. I'll just give a few more minutes for people to join because we are having a few people coming from a class and other things. Just so I'm just going to give them a few minutes.
I enjoyed your book presentation, by the way.
Mine?
Uh-huh.
Oh, okay. The one, the soil to foil.
Boy,
Yes. Oh, okay. Thank
very
you.
interesting.
Thank you. Yes, yeah, that was quite a fun book to write in terms of it's for a broader audience and though it is with the university press, with Columbia University Press, so it is peer reviewed and all, but it was written for like a lot larger audience in that regard. And so, oh, Julie's here too. Great. So I don't know if you know Julie Klinger, one of our faculty. She also works in similar arena of mineral policy issues and the like.
I don't know her personally, but I know her work.
Okay,
Nice to
great.
meet you, Julie.
Okay.
Nice to meet you
All
too. Welcome.
welcome. All right. So let us make sure it is being, I think it is being recorded. We're doing well on that. So all right, let's get started then. Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the last of our semester's Friday book seminar series. And we're delighted to welcome two authors today who are going to talk about their books that are on related topics. So the way we're going to work this through is we'll have a 20-minute presentation by one author and then 20 minutes by the other, and then we'll have Q&A discussion moving forward. So first of all, I'll introduce Professor Rose Spalding, who is Professor of Political Science at DePaul University, specializing in Latin American politics and environmental politics. And her new book, published by Oxford University Press, is Breaking Ground from Extraction Booms to Mining Bans in Latin America. And it has received great accolades, including from our friend Tony Bebbington, whom some of you will know was our Mather lecture speaker a couple of years ago. And he is himself a specialist in this area, currently working with the Ford Foundation, but has worked on human geography of minerals for many years, a member of the National Academies, and he wrote a glowing endorsement for Professor Spalding's book. And then secondly, then we will have Dr. Diana Arbelaez-Ruiz, who is joining us currently from Melbourne, Australia. She's a postdoctoral researcher, though, at the University of Eastern Finland, and she specializes in socio-political aspects of resource extraction. And I've had the good fortune of knowing and working with Diana many years ago when I directed the Center for Social Responsibility in Mining at the University of Queensland, where she did her doctorate. And we've done field work in Colombia. She was funded by a Ford Foundation project that was on Indigenous people and mining many years ago, and has worked all over the world and is a really meticulous scholar and someone who has been so also attentive to community needs. I have seen her operating in the field, and she's really phenomenal in terms of her care and persuasion working with very sensitive issues. So I'm so thrilled to see her book come out, which is partly based on her doctoral work, but also her practice. And she's currently in Australia, which is one of her countries of citizenship. And so thank you, Diana, for waking up early in the morning in Melbourne to join us as well. So with that, let's start off with Professor Spalding, and I believe you have a PowerPoint you would like to share.
Yes, I do. So,
Okay, great.
great, good. So thank you for the invitation, first of all, and for the opportunity to get to meet Diana and others who are here and will be asking questions. I'm sure I'm eager to hear what they would like to know more about. This is a book that took me, almost a decade to write, so it's hard for me to summarize it in 20 minutes, but I will do my best, at least give an introduction to the methodology and set of questions that it engages, and then the findings, and then we can follow up as people wish in the Q&A. Yeah, from extraction booms to mining bans. So I'm trying to look at the full range of policies that are operating in different Latin American countries using my background experience that focuses on Central America. It's in the series on studies in comparative energy and environmental politics. I'd encourage people to take a look at the other books in the series. Also very exciting work that's coming out. The topic for me is about national level mining policy. So there's a lot that's being written, very rich ethnographic community level research on mining conflicts at the local level. And that's not what this book is particularly about. I'm really looking at national level mining policy variation. So it's got a very specific kind of focus, and I'm trying to explain why this variation exists by country and also over time, because as we know, sometimes a country will start with a friendly mining friendly policy, and then this will change. And so documenting that process of change is also something that I'm trying to achieve. My argument is that the variation in national policy is shaped by the interaction of three processes. So the three things that come together. This is sort of conventional in policy studies, that people don't offer single factor explanations for things, but instead look at the way that multiple factors come together to try to explain something as complicated as policy shifts and policy variation, policy packages, which are sometimes internally inconsistent, those kinds of things. But the three factors I'm looking at are the extent of elite cohesion, the characteristics of the mining opposition movement itself, and then what I call the penetrability of the state, or in my language, the docking points, whether or not there are docking points for movements and civil society actors to be able to bring pressure on the state to respond to their preferences and their interest. The research method is controlled comparison. And so I'm selecting a small number of cases. Again, I've been doing research in Central America for 40 years and in different countries at different times. And so that made it possible for me to imagine bringing together analysis of 4 different cases as opposed to the more conventional 1 or 2 in comparative analysis. These have significant similarities, but with varied outcomes. So that's how I'm sort of setting it up, and then using process tracing to identify the factors that are involved. The 4 cases are, so I chose 2 that have mining friendly policies, at least in broad terms, mining friendly policies, and 2 that have mining restrictive policies. Again, trying to move beyond the conventional framing of just looking at a single case in competing categories as a way of pumping up the generalizability of the findings. So I'm not just looking at the particulars of individual cases. So I'm not asking, what caused Nicaragua to have mining friendly policies, but what caused Nicaragua and Guatemala, what are the factors that they share. that might bring about mining-friendly policies, and likewise with the mining restrictive policies. So I chose Costa Rica and El Salvador for pretty obvious reasons. Those are the two countries where mining is prohibited. So there are actual mining bans that were adopted in the Costa Rican case in 2010. The legislature approved, as it was, unanimously, ban on open pit mining. In El Salvador in 2017 approved, again unanimously. You know, some people didn't vote, but they did not. Decided not to register objections. So unanimous approval of a metallic mining ban in the Salvadoran case. So again, I'm asking myself, you know, not just why did Costa Rica adopt this, but why did Costa Rica and El Salvador adopt this? It's pretty easy, I think, to come up, you know, even if you don't know very much about Costa Rica, to come up with an explanation for why Costa Rica might have. But again, I'm not going with the simple task of figuring out Costa Rica. I'm saying, what is it that these two countries, which are really rather different in important ways, certainly politically, what is it that they have in common that might have allowed for mining restrictive policies to advance in both of those cases? So that's how I put it together. I'm doing what I call slow movement studies over an extended period of time. So this isn't just looking at, you know, a crescendo moment or a critical juncture, you know, some kind of very quick analysis, but really looking at processes over a long period of time in order to see what the transitions are, especially across time. Data sources are pretty conventional. Maybe because I'm a political scientist, I'm more comfortable with, you know, looking at the legislature and the way it operates, and the committee reports and findings, dictamens and votes and things like that, court filings, the gray literature, public opinion polls, which wind up being influential in terms of docking, and then of course interviews. I do think of myself as very much a field worker, spend as much time in the countries that I'm working on as I possibly can. And so I have conducted a lot of interviews across different sectors of the society in the 4 countries that I work in. So mining-friendly policies defined by the mining investors themselves. This table refers to the work of work that was done for the World Bank by Otto and colleagues, where executives were asked for what it was that they preferred, what it is they thought was most important in terms of determining their mining investments. Fraser Institute does this annually. So there are lots of different sources of this kind of information. You see, of course, profitability, ability to repatriate the profits are important considerations, but also there's a lot of reference to the ability to predetermine security of, you know, looking for continuity. They don't like to see policy changes being threatened, so they want stability in the policies that are in place. So this is just a slide from the Nicaraguan case. Nicaragua in the Central American region is, I'd say, the most mining friendly, most consistently mining friendly country in Central America. So it winds up being sort of anchoring a lot of the discussion about what are the circumstances under which you get this kind of policy. Mining restrictive policies. This is Guillermo Mata, who was the chair of the legislative committee on the environment at the time when the Salvadoran mining ban was approved. And so we're looking at mining restrictive policies. Again, lots of different ways in which you could talk about mining restrictions. What I've done here in the book is to look at 2 categories. One is sort of regulatory restrictions. The first 3 columns here are focus on that. Ways in which these can be changed and tightened and escalated. And then the last 3 columns focus on bans themselves. And bans are not a single thing. It's not, you know, just a simple sort of process. You can have lots of different kinds of bans. And so I'm looking at that too, provisional bans, temporary bans, usually in the form of moratoria, sometimes de facto moratoria, undeclared, but very, very much there. Postponement, shelving, delays, etc. Partial bans in geospecific areas or territorial bans that you can not have mining in specific areas, but you can have it in others, so then it becomes a partial ban, or a full national ban, as we have in the Costa Rican and Salvadoran case. Sometimes it's a ban based on technology or scale, different kinds of things like that. But that's the form of banning that I think is most extensive. So it occupies that end of a kind of spectrum of regulatory restrictions and bans. So just to very quickly move to my conclusions, we've got the question, under what circumstances do we have these different kinds of mining policies emerging? In these cases, as I said, I've got three what I call conditioning factors that seem to be at play. And the first is elite positions on mining. Here I'm looking at both political elites and economic elites. And of course, sometimes they overlap. The political elites are elected officials, leaders of political parties. And so I'm looking at the positions that they've taken on the question of mining. And the economic elites, I'm looking mostly at the places where you can see them and conduct real research, as opposed to the speculation we all engage in about what they really think behind the scenes. But the real research can be done, I think, by looking more at business associations and the pronouncements that they make and interviews you conduct with leaders of business associations and sectoral associations, the different chambers. And so here I'm looking at the positions taken by the business sector in this sort of formal way regarding mining, and also looking at whether or not mining interests form their own chamber and whether their chamber is admitted into the National Business Peak Association. If it becomes part of the business apparatus itself, that's sort of a signal that it's been incorporated into and that its interests are going to be represented by, at least in theory, the business chamber. If it's not incorporated, operates independently, then there's more space for tension, rivalry, competition to emerge. So the question is whether or not elites are united, political elites and business elites, in support of mining. If they think that that's important for national development, the extractivist vision of the economy is sort of welcomed as a source of growth and various benefits that are thought to be associated with it, or whether the elites are divided. And when the elites are divided, then you can begin to see major political parties taking opposing positions on mining. So that's an important consideration. Public positions taken by leading candidates or their challengers on whether mining would be something that should be advanced and friendly policies need to be adopted and adhered to, or if there's some skepticism about that. So if the major parties take opposing positions, then government support obviously will vary depending on which person gets elected. So in democratic systems, you typically have, even just, electoral democracies or formal democracies, some rotation in electoral victories. And that means government support for mining will vary depending on the electoral rotation process, which party is in power, which set of candidates are actually elected. And then in the business sector, you can see at times whether the business sector is characterized by division and fissure on this. A good illustration of that, I think, is in the Costa Rican case, where there's a very strong ecotourism sector, contributes to the National Peak Association in important ways, contributes to the economy and in major ways, and they were skeptical about mining because of, in part because of national branding issues, right? The country that's heavily involved in mining doesn't read, as being closely aligned with ecotourism and the promotion of the country as environmentally friendly. So, tensions can emerge, rivalries can emerge, competition can emerge within the business sector. And divide them on whether or not they want to promote mining. And sometimes you'll have a lot of support. The Nicaraguan case is really illustrative there, where the business community was very enthusiastic about mining. The mining chamber became part of the COSEP, the main business association, and even its representatives even rose to national level um, positions within the chamber. And so, you know, that you have that on the one hand, versus again competition in mining between different sectors. Sometimes it's agribusiness where there's competition over access to water, and that you saw a bit more in the Salvadoran case, and other cases, again, as I pointed out, ecotourism. So there's that theme, how the elite stand on mining, and then also how does this change over time as different sectors become stronger, begin to articulate their interests in divergent ways. The second is the resistance movement characteristics. Of course, we got a lot of research on this, since so many people working on mining conflicts really focus their energies on trying to understand the resistance movements. And here I'm arguing, you know, resistance movements are themselves, you know, quite varied in terms of the way they operate. And so I'm distinguishing between those in which the mining opposition is there for sure, but it's fragmented, it's weak, it's episodic. That is, it comes and goes. It's not consistent, not persistent over time. And also that it displays internal rivalries. Using the language and the framing of social movement theory, I spent a lot of time looking at issues of framing networks and multi-sectoralism in the networks, whether that existed or it tends to be, you know, absent, and also the frames that are used, and whether this frame alignment, you know, sometimes frame transformation to the point of frame alignment, or frame competition. And so this is, Nick Rao again illustrates this, I think, quite well, in that there were multiple opposition movements, but they did not really scale up to the national level. And each one of them understood their conflict over mining and the problems associated with mining in different ways. So you have an absence of frame alignment in that case, and the non-development of a national umbrella association that could bring their interests together, versus, say, in the case of El Salvador, where you had the formation of a single national organization, Mesa Nacional Frente a la Minería, which formed really in 2006, so fairly early in the game, was resilient, sustained, had a laser focus on the idea of a mining ban, even at a time when that seemed preposterous, like, of course, that's not going to happen. But that was their goal. They were unwavering in that. They developed multi-sectoralism. So, you know, it's not just the environmentalists, but it's also, you know, peasant associations. It's also, you know, the universities. In the Costa Rican case, you see a strong activism of environmental organizations, but also a lot of university mobilizations. So you have, again, multi-sectoralism, lots of tension among those who are engaged in the social mission of the Catholic Church, in pastoral accompaniment. So again, multi-sectoralism, sometimes scaling up even to the bishop level, you know, so then, you know, local and national alignments. So it's grounded in the community level, but it scales up. And the last piece is whether or not they're institutional docking points. And there are lots of different ways in which organizations, civil society movements can dock in the state system through political parties, candidates, state institutions, local government, if there are decentralization laws and some level of municipal autonomy that can be relevant, and community consultation mechanisms. So if these kinds of spaces are available for organizations at the local and national level to be able to input their preferences into the apparatus of the state in one way or another, then it becomes more possible to move toward mining restriction policies. If those docks are not available, there are no political parties that are responsive, no candidates that are accessible, the courts are unavailable, bureaucracies are insular, you know, those kinds of things, local governments lack autonomy, and there are no community consultation mechanisms in practice, and maybe exist in law, but in practice they don't operate, or they apply only selectively in the areas where the government has control. then the mining promoting policies are likely to be sustained, and mining restriction policies are likely not to be able to move forward. So that's the goal. Then this is the final point, and with this I will conclude. I'm looking at all of these features across the 4 cases, trying to come up with a summative analysis, and using that summative analysis to identify a policy model that got adopted, at least by the end of the process. Again, remembering that initially all 4 of these countries had mining friendly policies, and they all 4 had some overtures to mining investments, and they all 4 had some history of mining in the gold sector, which is where I focused my attention. But by the end, they had divergent policies and had moved along different tracks. So in the Nicaraguan case, you get sustained mine promotion, yes, in each of these categories. In the Guatemalan case, it's fascinating. I've been spending a lot of time looking at that lately. You have a sort of intermittent policy. Actually, at the moment, the mining is suspended. Metallic mining is suspended because the Constitutional Court said that the government had failed to conduct Indigenous community consultations. And so they forced a suspension of all operations until the consultations could take place. And so one of them has now been concluded. It's very complicated, has not yet restarted the mine for other kinds of reasons, but intermittent in the case of Guatemala, with basically friendly policy, but stalled because of that particular set of issues. In the Costa Rican case, there was resistant authorization. There's strong opposition, but they did move toward authorization until they didn't, starting in 2010. And so at that point, they moved toward prohibition. And in the Salvadoran case, they had an extended de facto moratorium that ultimately concluded with a ban. And that's where the no's line up most systematically. This is the last slide, and with this, I simply want to, this is from the Arbelaez-Ruiz. They were leading opponents to the development of mining in Costa Rica. And you can see just by looking at it, some of the themes, if you're talking about frames, how is the issue framed? You can see the emphasis on, species extinction, protection, and traditional values with the carrito that they deploy in their imagery. So just to make that final argument that the way the issues framed depends on the country. And with that, I will turn everything over to Diana.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor Spalding, both for the rich case analysis, but also a great lesson in methodology of comparative political analysis for our students, because using a 4 case example with the 3 variables, I think it's a really important kind of way to tease out these different aspects. And it actually reminds me of my own, one of my first book was also with 4 cases, in which I looked at 2 cases of where mining resistance from indigenous communities came forward, and in 2 cases where it didn't. So I think this quad case analysis is a really great way forward to analyze. All right. So if we don't have, do we have any clarifying questions from anyone? Otherwise, I think we'll do the Q&A together at the end. Okay, good. So with that, I'll turn it over to Diana, please.
All right, thank you, Salim. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, very good, thanks.
Thank you. I should start my video as well. Great. Well, that was wonderful to see Rosa's presentation. It was so interesting to hear the methodology, like Salim said. And Rose, you have a beautiful voice, so it's really lovely to hear you present as well. Thank you so much, Salim, for the invitation to present in this book seminar, and thanks everybody for being here, for your interest today. I am speaking from Brisbane, Australia today. So I begin by acknowledging the Turrbal and the Yagra people, who are the traditional custodians of the land from which I speak today, and I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to any First Nations people present today. The book that I present today addresses Indigenous responses to mining and their connection to peacebuilding, focusing on the experience of the Nasa Indigenous people of North Cauca during the most recent Colombian post-agreement transition. The Nasa are a very organized Indigenous people, part of a well-established resistance movement who are active in advancing Indigenous rights in Colombia. And the book is the result of a research collaboration with Nasa organizations and periods of writing and reflection at several research institutions. So I must begin by thanking the Association of Indigenous Authorities of North Cauca. Their acronym is ASIN. I'm going to be mentioning that acronym today, and the Indigenous Reserve of Canoas, which is like plural for canoe, for their participation in this research. And I want to thank the Tutenas, the highest authorities of ASIN, and the authorities of the Canoas Indigenous Reserve, and each of the Nasa community members that I met during the fieldwork that led to this book. I'm very grateful for the friendship and collaboration and mentorship of Marco Fidel Mosquera, Nelson Valencia, and Councilor Rosalba Velasco, who are all outstanding Nasa researchers and leaders, and also for the valuable support of Rodolfo Pilque and Caterina Martinez Muelas, who are also Nasa leaders. And in gratitude, I want to pay my respects to the memory of Albeiro Camayo, who was coordinator of the ASIN Guardia Indígena. It is a form of voluntary civic card, indigenous civic card, during my stay in North Cauca. And Albeiro helped me plan and coordinate safe access to several indigenous reserves. May we always remember his courage, his sacrifice, and service in protecting the rights and territories of his community. I'm also very grateful to mentors and colleagues and my advisors at the Sustainable Minerals Institute, the University of Queensland, the University of Eastern Finland, and the Peace Research Institute Oslo, who helped and accompanied me along the way. So Indigenous Responses to Mining in Post-Conflict Colombia takes you into the Nasa territories where people face tensions and difficult decisions connected to mining, to the armed conflict, and to peace building. There is gold mining in North Cauca. There's gold mining of many sorts, including a legalized indigenous mine, but also unauthorized mining that illegal armed groups benefit from. In the book, I narrate several experiences and present the views of participants from Nasa organizations with different perspectives on mining. I share about the research process, which was an ethnographic exploration, and how with the Nasa organizations we weave together our collaborative work. So I would like to read some excerpts of the book for you to bring you closer to the people and the places and the situations in the book, and also the arguments that I present there. So let's begin. Are the slides, do you see slides moving? You should be seeing a yellow flower.
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely beautiful.
Great, so I'll begin. One evening in early 2017, I was staying at the Nasa Indigenous Reserve of Canoas in the mountains of Cauca, Colombia, when I heard an enthusiastic community radio announcement. It said, "The authorities of the Canoas Indigenous Reserve invite all community members to join tomorrow's working bee against mining, to defend life, Mother Earth, our communities, and our territories. Bring your lunch, machetes, shovels, and lots of spiritual strength." And a pause here, don't get any ideas. The machetes are to cut through the bush as you walk up the mountain. The morning after, my Nasa host and I joined members of the Nasa Indigenous community at the meeting point in the Canoas Indigenous Reserve. That was one of many days I spent learning about how Nasa communities and organizations respond to mining amidst Colombia's peace agreement negotiation and implementation with the guerrillas of the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, FARC. This was the subject of my exploration from 2015 to 2018 and beyond, with the collaboration of Nasa organizations of North Cauca. I sought to understand community responses to mining and their moral underpinning, how people judge whether and under what conditions an economic activity such as mining is acceptable or desirable, shapes community positions and actions towards that activity. In this context, we need to turn to the role of the moral economy. The moral economy is an understanding of the economy that concentrates on morality, rather than atomized agency as the necessary context to study the economy. The notion of the moral economy gains particular relevance in societies undergoing conflict to peace transitions, where some of the divisions have moral undertones. I contend that at the core of Nasa resistance to mining are fundamental community moral principles that for many Nasa mining is a continuation of armed conflict, violence, oppression, and colonization processes that started with the Spanish invasion in 1492. That in consequence, many Nasa resist mining, and that the resistance is neither monolithic nor without the complexities that accompany material poverty. In all, I'll argue that anyone aiming to contribute to dialogue, peace, or development initiatives related to mining in this sensitive time in Colombia needs to engage with the moral debates about mining and with the specificity of community responses to mining in order to avoid fueling further conflict. But to return to the Nasa of North Cauca, who are the Nasa? Where did this working bee against mining happen? Here are a few brief points. If you're from Colombia, you're likely to have heard of the Nasa, very likely. They are one of the most organized indigenous people in Colombia, part of a well-established resistance movement, active in advancing indigenous rights as an agenda in their territory and more broadly in Colombia. They have contributed to this through proposals, dialogue, and large-scale social mobilization that they're known for. Like other indigenous Colombians, the Nasa are among the most materially poor and most affected by the armed conflict and illegal mining. North Cauca covers around 13 municipalities in the northern area of Colombia's Cauca department. It encompasses the foothills of the Western Andean chain, the inter-Andean valleys and rivers that supply water to human settlements and agriculture. So from large cities and industrial agriculture to small towns and subsistence agriculture. And within that territory, approximately 112,000 Nasa live and have 12 indigenous reserves, so resguardos, and 20 indigenous authorities or cabildos. Colombia's 1991 constitution gives these communities administrative, legal, judiciary, educational, and health autonomy. Opposition to mining, while not the only position taken, was prevalent among the Nasa participants of this study and was the official stance of the indigenous authorities of many resguardos, as is clear from the community radio invitation that you heard before. So let us attend to that community radio voice. A loudspeaker on a motorcycle played the carefully voiced over and musicalized call to action. The background music was packed with images of resistance delivered in the chorus of Mercedes Sosa's song, Hermano Dame Tu Mano, or Brother Give Me or Lend Me Your Hand. As the Argentinian social protest singer's voice faded in the distance, the song spoke about how the land awaits people's action. The next morning, many residents of the Canoas Indigenous Reserve responded to the call, on foot, by motorcycle, or by chiva, which is a colorful traditional Colombian bus. They came to the meeting point at the headquarters of the local indigenous authority, the Indigenous Cabildo of Canoas. An eagerness for action was palpable on that crisp morning. The participants wanted to work, to stop mining in the nearby indigenous reserve of Munchique. But why? The Nasa have been exposed mostly to illegal mining of a predatory and violent kind, an industry that has grown uncontrollably in Colombia, leaving social and environmental degradation in its path. They do not hold large-scale mining in high regard either. In general, Nasa perceptions of large-scale mining are negative too. As a result, the prevalent view among the Nasa participants of this research, both leaders and community members, is that as mining enters Nasa territory, it clashes with their moral principles, threatening the Nasa world. Just a couple of weeks before, one of their own died in a mining-related dispute between indigenous people in the Munchique Indigenous Reserve. Some members of the Munchique and Canoas reserves were reportedly mining in Munchique territory. All of them were ignoring the indigenous authorities' ban on mining. Mining effectively divided the communities. It saw the indigenous authorities overlooked and brought violence and the unfortunate death of a young person. And this was not the first time. Accounts by several people from Canoas spoke of land degradation and loss of livelihoods, unexplained deaths, family violence, violent groups threatening leaders and community groups, community division, miners neglected children becoming easy recruits for guerrillas and other violent groups, and so other social and environmental elements. So following the violent death of the young miner from Canoas, the indigenous authorities of the North Caucasus Zone held an assembly to discuss this tragedy. And in assemblies like this about issues that concern communities, they make decisions that the communities expect to see implemented. At that assembly, they decided to come together to stop mining in Munchique. The authorities of Munchique and Canoas were not alone. Other regional and sub-regional indigenous organizations backed them. The intercommunity division, the violence, had rang loud alarm bells of a possible rupture in the indigenous movement. The indigenous authorities convened the Minga, or Working Bee, to perform a large-scale action with the presence of external observers, including United Nations Human Rights Commission, delegates, journalists, and researchers like myself. So that's an example for you of the kinds of situations the organizations face and the decisions that they make. And now I want to share with you a testimonial of a member of the Nasa Indigenous Guard, which is, as I said, a voluntary civic guard that protects life, rights, and territory. Carlos was his pseudonym, a Guardia leader, was careful to differentiate between what he saw as mining activities that indigenous authorities allow and are not seen as deleterious, and those involving heavy machinery owned by powerful external forces. Having inspected the sites in person, Carlos could readily describe the difference. So this is what he said to me. Suppose it's artisanal mining. No one will oppose that. Working with a pan and a shovel, the miner works to find the gold. He may or may not get it, but a diga, or two, or three, that is really complicated. Wherever you see one digger, you find 100 to 200 people panning for gold. Is an informal miner going to work with machinery, 4 or 5 diggers? Sometimes they say, we are starving. So we ask them, how can they get 5 diggers? How much is a digger? No one with limited resources is going to venture out with 5 diggers into a territory where they can get confiscated. They know we can confiscate them. So Carlos empathized with the fellow community members seeking an independent livelihood, but had no time for others he saw as pawns of exploitative forces. When machinery was involved, the Guardia destroyed or confiscated it. So that's the view from somebody from the Guardia, but you may also want to hear what an indigenous miner had to say. Several of them spoke to me. This person's pseudonym was Buena Vista, another member of the Nasa community who worked in mining in a territory where the Cabildo, the indigenous authority, opposes mining. I interviewed Buena Vista at the home of one of his relatives, in his resguardo, where we were allowed privacy in an open area to have a conversation. It took a while to get to meet him and for him to be comfortable to talk. But on the day of the interview, he was very keen to offer his views as long as he was not identified. Buena Vista combined mining and agriculture to make a living for his family. Mining income had enabled investment in his farm and improvement in his family's standard of living. He was fond of his mining work. The first thing he said to me was, I must tell you that mining is something very beautiful, something I like a lot. It is risky, it is dangerous, but it becomes part of you. You feel it and you miss it. Not all the time, but you never forget about it. So the possibility of creating value or wealth for him and his family really emboldened Buena Vista, in particular because he found very few other alternatives. That's the case with many of the miners. His mining work consisted of buying materials out of the mining tunnels to process them in a mill to extract gold. So Buena Vista told me that when he looked at the soil he purchased, he felt encouraged to think that it had value and from there would come resources to invest in his farm or in housing for his family. A more nuanced understanding of mining surfaced when I asked Buenavista what would happen if the younger people in his family chose to practice mining, and when we spoke about the mining-related death. With future generations in mind, Buenavista started speaking of mining as a last resort for him and expressed more concern about the negative effects of mining. He was definitive that he would not encourage future generations to mine because of safety, environmental, and moral reasons. We ought to stop, he said. I would tell them it is very dangerous. A rock can fall at any time and leave you with a disability or take your life, he added. So those are some passages I wanted to offer to you that speak to different situations and perspectives that I describe in the book. I would now like to briefly cover the overall argument I present in the book. I explored the customary moral frameworks that inform community views and responses to mining, ideas of peace and peace-building activities. I place community responses to mining in post-conflict Colombia in a position of centrality, recognizing the agency and the sophisticated organizational processes of the Nasa of North Cauca. Often studies of post-conflict natural resource governance have sought to prescribe community roles and steer community actions in the direction that the international peace-building community considers appropriate, considering communities mostly as passive. So the story of the Minga, the working bee in Monchique, is but one example of how the Nasa are far from passive. They are part of an indigenous movement of colossal strength, with many autonomies recognized in the Colombian Constitution, active in the peace-building arena, with a sophisticated tradition of social mobilization, whose public discourse expresses direct moral opposition to the growth of large-scale other forms of high-impact mining operations in Colombia. So it is necessary to ask, what can we learn from what communities are doing from their own questions, tensions, and difficulties in addressing mining-related problems in a post-agreement transition? I contend that while the prevalent Nasa view was that mining causes moral breaches and risks Nasa lives and aspirations, there is more nuance and tension when it comes to miners that are members of the Nasa community. The Nasa moral economic thinking delineates an organic perspective of the economy, where correct actions equate to life-sustaining reciprocity and transgressions sever vital reciprocity. The Nasa ideals about buen vivir, or having a good life, and their moral principles contrast with the mining-induced moral and economic shifts in their territories and underpin the no to mining mandates there. There are internal tensions because material need and an urge to protect Nasa territories from external miners have seen the emergence of Nasa miners, independently or with the support of their Nasa authorities. And those who do not oppose mining ask for a pragmatic test to the no position, considering material circumstances, economic, legal, and environmental dynamics. And being a Nasa miner or mining territory, which there are territories that have their legal mine, is marked with moral contradictions that persist despite efforts to elucidate a coherent moral discourse. I found that many Nasa observed strong links between an expanding mining frontier and violence and repression against them, which mobilized them to resist these forms of mining despite limited government support. They resist through practices that are consistent with their tradition of resistance to the armed conflict and with the resistance practices of other Latin American indigenous people. Nasa responses to mining are part of an institutionalized, everyday resistance. They include a legal dimension in an institutional design, livelihood projects, territorial control and enforcement, and research, dialogue, and collaborative advocacy that are not uniform, instead involve local nuance and interpretation. So this multifaceted and multi-layered resistance consumes a significant community resources at the sub-regional and local levels. In contrast, the Colombian government of the time had failed to halt illegal mining in Nasa territories and to support Nasa mining community ventures. Exploring the links between the Nasa responses to mining and peace-building work, I observed that when mining by outsiders was concerned, there was broad consensus that resisting mining equated building peace. There's a prevalent view that among the Nasa, that there are connections between mining and illicit economic networks with links to violent armed groups. However, livelihood dilemmas, aspirations for better material conditions, and political contests see some NASA participate in unsanctioned mining ventures in indigenous territories. In these scenarios, the NASA are divided on what constitutes peace building when responding to mining is concerned. Ultimately, violent creep seen through the cracks left by dispossession and material poverty, while the Colombian society fails to attend to those problems in rural territories such as North Cauca, so that communities' best efforts continue to fall short. NASA organizations find themselves filling out the gaps that other peacebuilding actors leave. The NASA need national and international actors to respond to the interactions between mining and armed conflict through support for the NASA peacebuilding work and with complementary actions coherent with the NASA's late reality. So that is a broad outline of some of the situations. I observed some of the positions people shared with me and the argument that I advanced in the book. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Diana, for that splendid pictorial and oral narration, and giving us a very textured view of the indigenous voice in North Cauca. So for the students especially, you will recognize that there are different scales of social science analysis. You've got Diana presenting a more anthropological approach, going down to the level of the individual. And then you have Rose presenting a more macro level approach to understanding mining resistance from the political science perspective. So in geography, we cover all of these different approaches, which is one of the joys of geography. And we also cover the natural science by side with the physical geographers who work on the earth science aspects and so on. So with that, then I will open it up for Q&A. But before we get that, and while we have students and others thinking about questions, I thought maybe the two authors might want to engage also in a conversation if either of them have questions for each other. One of the reasons for also having them together is that in Latin America, and in Latin America, I'm including Central and South America together, there is a lot of learning crossover among indigenous movements, anti-mining movements, mining capitalism and all. And there are some themes which are common. There's lots of divergences, of course, as we can tell from Rose's case comparisons. But the resistance movement especially do have a lot of learning that goes on. So please, yes, while the others are thinking of questions, I'd give the opportunity to both Rose and Diana to engage in a conversation as well.
Thank you, Salim. I was curious when I was listening to Rose, because we were talking with a colleague about it's not a country that you've covered, but Panama is also, there's all these things happening now there with the ban and so on. So I was curious about whether you have observed that some of these strategies, these ways of configuring possibly the bans that might be spreading, like what Salim was saying, people are borrowing from the learning processes in other countries. It definitely does happen with indigenous resistance throughout the whole region. People are very connected and sharing and supporting each other, when they are in trouble.
I am following what's going on in Panama because it's fascinating, and it came up fairly quickly and has turned into a major issue. The last chapter of my book also looks at investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms. So when mining investors find themselves thwarted because a ban is imposed, or even a moratorium it goes on, they have different options. And one is that they can bring a claim against the government and ask for compensation and use it as leverage to try to force the government to change the policy. And that seems to be in play right now in the Panamanian case. there's a lot of I mean, they've already filed a claim against the Panamanian government, and there's speculation about how much they're going to be asking for. Supposedly, they've invested $10 billion in building the mine, the predecessor mine that they wanted a continuation of. And the local experts are saying they're going to be requesting 50 billion in compensation, which, given the size of the Panamanian economy, is mind-boggling. So, I'm following it because there are also these cases against all of the Central American countries that I've worked on, and it's just a form of external pressure that makes it very difficult for the national government to respond to domestic forces, because they have to also deal with these international mechanisms. There have been international organizations of mining resistance movements in Central America, and they do provide each other with advice, experience, materials, resources that they share. I don't know in the Panamanian case how much of that has been shared with Panama, which is a little bit of a stepchild in Central America. The other countries tend to connect more smoothly than they do with Panama, perhaps because of the history, the distant history as part of Colombia, and in some sense of separation. But I'm fascinated with your observations about the way indigenous groups do connect internationally and learn from each other, and are very open to that. So I wanted to ask you a question about, because your focus in your comments today was on the local level. I'm interested in how this scales up to the national level, and whether there are strong mechanisms that connect the various forms of resistance with each other, or if this is another case where, ambiguity and division, even at the local level, when the miners are themselves from the area and it's sort of smaller scale and presumably less environmentally damaging and more understandable as an economic need. So if there's division at the local level, I'm assuming that the overall in Colombia, there's a lot of division about how to respond to mining, and that makes it difficult to scale up some kind of argument about a coherent national response. But I'd love to hear your comments on that.
Yeah, thank you, Rose. It's a really good observation. Well, Colombia is a divided country on everything, full stop. Maybe not when there's a football game, that might be the only time when it isn't, but it is very divided. And there are these difficulties within indigenous communities because of the material precarity that in particular young people find themselves in. But as a movement, the position tends to be pretty solid, the official position. It's more within the community how they deal with when somebody gets involved in mining. And it's very unified when it comes to large-scale mining, for example. Yeah. And the indigenous movement in Colombia, it also has this national organizations. So the Cauca organizations are among the first ones to have been formed. Well, really, the first indigenous organization in Colombia was the Cauca one. And then with time, there was national and other organizations. So I would say the Cauca organizations have played a very strong leadership role. And the position on mining from the indigenous organizations tends to be also officially pretty solid. There's more tolerance of mining when it's really artisanal or ancestral, or when there is this collaboration with Afro-descendant communities, which are not indigenous, but they're tribal peoples, and that's part of their economic matrix and their cultural heritage as well. So, and the practices are more, ancestral practices. So in that part of the kind of ethnic and indigenous movement, there can be more consolidation in the official positions. Now, positions, again, around mining in Colombia, there is division because the elites are very consolidated in support in some cases. But as you know, we now have a left-wing government, and that has shown another type of elite. And then this opportunity for people who are not from these ethnic groups, peoples, indigenous peoples to also articulate their opposition because of mechanisms that are in the 1991 Constitution. So prior consultation, consultas populares, popular consultations have been used. Yeah, anyway, I could go on and on, but a lot of, there is a lot of division, and within those kind of different parties to the argument, they tend to be fairly consolidated in their positions, is what I have observed, at least in Cauca.
Great. Thank you, Diana. Well, we have two questions now, and I'll maybe ask both to ask the questions together, and then we'll get responses, and then we'll do questions in pairs. So first, Natalie Ralph is joining us from the UK, I believe, right? We're delighted. And Natalie and I crossed paths when she was in Australia, but I think she's moved. So Natalie, please introduce yourself to.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for this seminar. I've really enjoyed it, and I've actually already ordered both your books for our library here. So my name is Natalie Ralph. I'm currently at University of Warwick in United Kingdom, and so my question is related to I've got a bit of a background in business and peace issues, but I don't have much background, detailed knowledge on Indigenous issues. However, saying that, I am actually excited to be able to be exploring these issues a little bit more due to the program of work I'm doing at Warwick. So at the moment, I'm looking at, like many people, critical minerals or critical materials, you might call them. For example, the minerals that are needed for technology, renewable energy technology, laptop, lithium, cobalt, etc. And I'm exploring the new international diplomatic partnerships that are being established by Western countries predominantly, such as one of them being the Mineral Security Partnership. The language that you see coming out of the Mineral Security Partnership and G7, G20, IEA, etc., International Energy Agency, etc., is that because of the exponential growth in mining for these critical minerals, we're going to do it better. We're going to do it differently now. And we're going to really support sustainable development, for example, through, quote, high ESG standards, and recycling and reuse is often also promoted. So my question is, both Rose and Diana, and Salim, if you would like to drop anything in there, what do you think of that? What do you think of this language that's being used, that it's going to be done differently? The UK, the US, Australia, etc., are going to increase, do sustainable development far better through these high ESG standards. Do you think that's possible? What are your first thoughts from your perspectives, please? And finally, may I just also ask as well, throw in there, because of the expertise in the room, do you think that mining and peace issues, mining and conflict issues are now going to become more, as in research, is going to become more important because of this so-called exponential growth for these critical minerals? Thank you both.
Great, thanks, Natalie. So, well, that's quite a lot to digest. So maybe we'll take this question and then come back to Gabriela. So I think maybe at the macro level, Rose, you can address with reference, as a political scientist, you probably also look at the geopolitics of these issues and so on. If you want to comment first on the critical minerals aspect and that Natalie was asking.
Okay, I'll start. The last question you asked is, of course, the easiest one, because I think the answer is pretty obviously yes. As we have an intensification of the industry, it's highly conflictual. I think predicting and further rounds of conflict it seems like a pretty easy prediction to come up with. Whether higher standards could resolve these issues. I mean, I think as you listen to the kinds of objections that groups are raising and networks are raising, it's not necessarily about higher standards. Sometimes it's really about community self-definition, who we are and how we exist in the world. And so the introduction of higher environmental standards, even if it were to take place, is not necessarily addressing the concerns that they have. So there's that. I mean, it's sort of a technocratic response. From the standpoint of those who are coming up with it, it makes sense. But from the standpoint of those living with these questions on the ground, it may not. And I want to thank Salim for all the work that you're doing, you know, bringing information to the whole network, including the most recent piece, which I think came out maybe yesterday, about the new statement by Indigenous leaders that was signed and directed to the COP that's underway.
Yes.
Very, very interesting. You see, and then it was connected to an article that's just come out. I guess it's formally released, about how the vision about the critical minerals is that those projects will be largely on Indigenous lands or near Indigenous lands or near peasant lands. You know, 29% of the projects that they're envisioning for the future would be in what are sort of geolocated as Indigenous territories or within 10 kilometers. I mean, the way they worked out the methodologies, again, very interesting. So that suggests that that's going to be another flashpoint, and it will be quite durable. Now, it may be possible for them, you know, the international forces to begin to think about the lands that are not Indigenous, or, you know, where might they focus their energies in territories that are less conflictual, where the environmental problems are less sustained. So then you get to, you know, partial bans and geospecific bans that free Indigenous populations from having to deal with these kinds of, as they would perceive it, threats, and that concentrate the development of the new sectors, the new projects in lands that are less, you know, precarious or vulnerable, that are more stable, where regulatory policy is more fully implemented, you know, things like that. So that may be a way forward. Let me turn it to Deanna and see what she has to say.
Thank you, Rose, and thank you, Natalie, for the question. I mean, where to begin? So my current work is all about the geopolitics of mostly electric vehicle battery minerals, the work I do at the University of Eastern Finland. And there is so much in your question, so let's go by parts. So first thing is these claims about ESG. I've been interviewing people here in Western Australia exactly about that, because you hear that statement so much thrown around. Our, for example, with Australian policy, our high ESG credentials. What do you mean by that? You know, what does ESG mean nowadays? When I started working in Australia, I spent about 9 years working as an ESG analyst when nobody was keen on ESG, you know, and it was for the investment sector. It had a very clear definition. Now I think I was talking to somebody from PRIO the other day, you know, on email, and he's going to publish a book. They found about 1,000 and something different definitions of ESG. So the language is very unclear. It's not even, we don't really know exactly what ESG means. But it seems to me it has a lot to do with access to markets, because the markets where the batteries are going to be used and the infrastructure, some of those markets are putting you know, requirements on environmental and social and on governance matters. I feel that there is a disconnect there, because sometimes the ESG that the market is interested is very different to the ESG that happens in places like where the Nasa are. So you might be talking about the greenhouse intensity of lithium that's in a battery, which is important to a European client, where an indigenous community in the Atacama Desert may not care very much about the greenhouse intensity of that lithium, okay? So it is, there's issues of definition there. And certainly there's going to be, I'm skeptical about whether this is possible at the speed, because I think at the moment the name of the game is kind of urgency and speed. Everybody wants these minerals, they want them quickly. Somehow there was not enough foresight. Certain states had the foresight and got into controlling the supplies and the technologies, and that kind of the rest of the world is kind of caught out that there's not enough know-how, facilities, processing facilities, not enough mines. So it's a bit tricky to imagine that trying to fast track is also going to allow increasing environmental, social, and governance standards. Yeah. And yes, like Ross was saying, the Center for Social Responsibility in Mining, they've published these several papers on this overlap between the indigenous state or the peasant lands and mining projects. And there's a lot of uncertainty. And often this is when there's a boom, there's an avalanche of consultations to communities. And in some places, you know, in Western Australia, the indigenous representative bodies can be very well resourced and very used to dealing with proponents. In other places, maybe they have dealt with a proponent for a long time, but they're not as well resourced. If you get in this critical mineral sector, there's a lot of junior companies. You can also, there's also questions with that, you know, when it's a company of 6 people and these indigenous people are dealing with several of those people approaching them. And yeah, I have a lot of questions about that. We want to think that yes, that it is going to happen, but there's a lot of concern on whether that's actually possible, and whether there will be enough attention to the producing side and the impacts on the community, or if it's going to get lost in the securitizing discourse, you know, for the energy transition, which is very important, of course. But will we also, yeah.
Thank you, Diana. No, indeed, and your current work, I would love to learn more about. Maybe we will do another seminar on that too, because we have a lot of people working on critical minerals here in Delaware. Okay, next question is from Gabriela Mundaka, who is also one of our affiliate faculty here, originally from Peru, and is an economist. So, Gabriela, over to you.
Diana, for the presentation. It was very interesting. I have a question two questions perhaps, to both of you. What are your experiences with respect to the these environmental impact assessments that governments are supposed to have? How are they used? How much are they used? And they are enforced? You know, I guess that would be in charge of the Ministry of Environment if you have anyone in those countries. And the second question is that perhaps to Diana that has been working on the field, maybe I should say, let me pose a question. What are the views of the indigenous people, the communities, about the effect of mining on their health? And also, how do they view the importance of mining and their life and their welfare? Is it more important than the agriculture, which is agriculture usually is the activity that they are concentrated on, right? So the reason I'm asking these two questions is because I have done some work on the cost evaluation of mining on the health and the environment of indigenous people in Peru and in Cusco. So, and that was, I found that health and environment was very important for them, right? So I was wondering, Diana, what did you hear from them? Do they feel that mining is affecting their health? And because in my case, it was like we don't need mining. We want to just live on agriculture, right? They found that mining was not really so crucial for their life, right? So, but I don't know, maybe in Colombia it's different, maybe in Nicaragua it's different roles, or Honduras, all the cases that you study, you know. So they really say we have been working with agriculture for so many years, and now it's now being damaged because of the mining, right? So I just wanted to hear your opinion about this aspect. Thank you.
Great. Yep. So, Rose, would you like to start up, or Diana, either one?
And I can start. I think Deanna has more to say on the second round of the second part of the question. But on the environmental impact assessments, yes, you're right. Those are supposed to be a kind of a safety measure that would allow both community consultation in some cases, that is some built into the process, and of course technical analysis and restrictions on the most potentially damaging and inadequately prepared mining projects. So it should play that role. But, interestingly, in the 4 cases that I've worked on, even in the Costa Rican case, the environmental ministry has not always been successful. And you would think the Costa Rican case, because it's, institutions are stronger and governments has greater capacity, that would have been one where you would have restrictions, but at least in a critical juncture, when the mining company changed its plan and they did not require a reassessment of the project proposal, they went ahead and the president issued a decree, authorizing it. So the mechanisms that are built in to try to protect communities from harm, again, even in relatively strong cases, don't always operate. And in the weaker cases, it's a disaster. If you look at Guatemala, for example, in the way the environmental impact assessments are done there, the government plays almost no role. Companies are required to produce one. So there's something that's done under contract with a company, an environmental impact assessment apparatus produces a report, but the government really doesn't check it. Almost never do they raise any questions about it. Don't have the capacity. The number of people within the ministry who are capable of reviewing those and offering independent judgment about them is just minuscule compared to the number of cases that they got to work on. So yes, there's space for development, for improvement, and increased capacity that might make it more possible to proceed with less environmental damage by operating through the institutions. But in terms of the past record, it's not particularly propitious. So let me turn it to Diana.
I think I was unmuted and I muted myself. Thank you, Gabriela. So yes, in Colombia, there's a lot of different institutions. It used to be the environment ministry. You would go through different, what's called the competent environmental authority, depending on the level of the project, if you like, and it could be appealed higher and higher up. But there's been, in the last 10 years or so, there's been new institutions, and there's now the ANLA, the Autoridad Nacional de Licenciamiento Ambiental, so National Environmental Licensing Authority. In terms of how participative those studies are, I think it really depends very much on the proponent of the project. And some would do it participatively and some don't, because I know of projects that have been given environmental licenses in Cauca, and the people didn't even know. The people who live in the area didn't know, and the environmental authority didn't talk to them either. To your question about indigenous health, it's interesting because because the notion of health is is not so compartmentalized, if you like, as it can be in Western settings. So an example with the Nasa, the notion of, they would talk more about harmony, being in harmony and living in harmony, and it doesn't end with kind of the boundaries of your body. It's about being in harmony with yourself, with your family, with your community, with the land where you work, and it has a ritual component. So whenever anybody has, I will get to your question, you will see, whenever anybody has a health problem, like his physical health problem, the treatment involves many things, including a ritual component and community work. So in that sense, the intervention of the territory that is seen as a motherly being by the indigenous community, that intervention without the permission of the spiritual beings and the life spaces is how they're called, is in itself an affront against the health of a community. Yeah. And of course, it also creates, if we were going to look at it in more sort of Western terms, this tends to create a lot of uncertainties, even just proposing, even if it's not advanced, proposing the uncertainty, the threat that the place could be compromised. So yes, it is very much seen as an issue of health, not only because of pollution and what it can do to your body, but because of this other kind of also pollution and kind of the degradation of the environment. When people spoke to me, they would talk a lot about it in this kind of organic language, about mining kind of eroding, creating decay in the territory. So, and you mentioned about, there was a part of the question that was on agriculture. Is that right?
You know, I was asking, you know, do they find, for example, because, you know, the mining brings a lot of resources, right? At least to the country, maybe not to them directly. But agriculture is something more on local activity, their activity, right? Mining is somewhat alien to them, right? So in my experience, they told me, you know, so mining is not close to us. We don't participate in mining. So we prefer to be working agriculture, right? So mining, they didn't find mining something useful for their welfare, you know. So I was wondering what in your field study, what do the indigenous people think about mining in relation to their other economic activities? You know, how important was mining for their welfare, economic, you know, standard of living, you know?
Yes, I see what you're saying, where you're coming from. Well, that is at the center of the whole political position and the actions to determining, because the history of the indigenous movement in Colombia is, it was part of the campesino movement, and then they decided to differentiate through their indigeneity. Yeah, and so the origins of the movement, it's very much about land rights, about agrarian reform. Yeah, and historically, because of the colonial process, Peru did have agrarian reform, Colombia barely, right? So historically, what indigenous populations saw was that they were used as indentured labor, like they were in servitude. And one of the most important elements of their kind of liberation was to be released from that. So land rights are very important for them. And one is because you don't want to be paying tribute to a landowner, and you want to have food security but also because land has other components. It's not just agriculture. Land has other meanings in terms of that's where people recreate their memory. That's where the history is kind of inscribed and the identity. So in the moral principles of the Nasa people and then the people of Cauca, land is one of the moral principles, and the protection of the land and having their own land and not letting indigenous state be diminished. And one component is food security. And another component is that land is a source of rights for them and a subject of rights as well, within the territories where they can exercise all these collective rights. Now, I'm not sure. I don't think I agree that they always would think agriculture, because of the Colombian case. Agriculture can be, yes, small-scale agriculture is the model that the Nasa people promote, and what they want to see see as reflective of their identity is small-scale, more organic agriculture, very integrative of and reflective of the local biodiversity. You have a small plot of land and you have a lot of species there. But in the same area in Cauca as well, there's a history of monoculture, of large-scale, industrial agriculture, sugarcane. From the colonial times, a lot of people were forced into slavery there. So there's also a relationship with the large-scale industrial monoculture that is very foreign to them and that they resist. So yes, their own family-based agriculture, certainly in opposition to mining projects that are external, but there is that negative relationship with large-scale monoculture. And then mining, you have the difficult relationship with external proponents, but there's tolerance with some mining that is artisanal. So there's a lot of local nuance.
So do they want to have mining at all?
Sorry?
Do they want to have mining at all? How do they view about mining? They are okay having mining in their lands and their communities?
I think that is what, Diana was saying earlier, Gabriela, is a very nuanced issue but when she asked that miner that he was favorable initially, but then when she asked him about the next generation, the miner was like, no, I don't want mining for my children, right? So it's like a last resort. Am I right, Diana?
Yeah, for some people it's a last resort, but it varies a lot from territory to territory. There's a position that is no to mining,
Mm-hmm.
want to protect because the land is so important to the survival of these communities. And when the land is possession to external miners, there's just too much transformation and control handed over. So they protect it. But then there's also, because it's so complicated, the way the legal framework is set up in Colombia is such that you can prevent, as an indigenous community, you can prevent a miner external from getting into your territory if you get your indigenous mining zone, is called. So some indigenous groups, communities have that there, but they don't want to do mining. They want to
That's
outside.
right.
The thing is that some of them got caught out in not knowing that then they would have to start paying the government. And sometimes those financial obligations are too onerous. But in general, what they prefer is to make decisions about their lands according to their own priorities and their own mandates and law, and not to have that imposed or to have external people who don't know how to manage the territory come in. That is kind of the overall.
Yeah, and that I think, like, from the findings of my research from that book, which I was mentioning, which I wrote 20 years ago almost, Mining the Environment and Indigenous Development Conflicts. For Indigenous people, a lot of it is about how sovereignty gets operationalized in terms of the mining project. And so the 4 cases I looked at there, the ones where the puzzle I was looking at was that mining was being resisted in cases where the environmental impact was less, and it was being opposed where the environmental impact was more. So the technocratic hypothesis was not explaining the resistance. So like uranium mining, which environmentally was very problematic in Saskatchewan, was being supported by the Indigenous community in that case. But you had a project in Labrador, which was a nickel mine with a lot of concessions, which was being opposed. And so, a lot of it became like, how did the mining company kind of operationalize sovereignty? But it is a very complex area overall for research, and also with reference to the whole notion of um, ownership, who owns property rights and has access, that becomes a very interesting attribute also. So well, we're close to the end of our time, but thank you so much to first of all to our speakers for joining us. Rose is joining us from Chicago. Diana is joining us from Brisbane, from far corners of the earth. And to all of you also for joining us. We are going to have this recording available afterwards on the YouTube channel, so please do share and spread that. I should mention that in terms of my own role with the United Nations International Resource Panel, the Latin American mining situation is very much on the front burner in terms of a new report we're doing on mineral finance that will be published next year. And the way in which some of these mining bans have come through, or mining moratoria, that's also being considered in terms of the finance aspects of minerals, the critical minerals which may be needed for the green transition. So I look forward to further engagement. And then also on this last point, I might mention for the students, this ambivalence which communities have around mining. It just occurred to me with a classic book, which I'm sure Rose and Diana are aware of, but for the students, is June Nash's work on Bolivia, which is the title tells us the ambivalence. The title is "We Eat the Mines and the Mines Eat Us," and it's a fascinating. Oh, there you have it. Diana has the book with her. It's just such a potent and powerful, anthropological work on mining and this challenge of this inevitability, this sense of loss and despair. And Potosi, of course, is one of these really heartbreaking cases where there's been mining since Spanish colonial times. And, the BBC estimated, I think, by one measure that over 10 million people died in those mines. There are different estimates, but it is in the millions, literally, since Spanish colonial period to the present day, where there is still mining going on. So Latin America is really quite a powerful sort of geographic space for this whole activity. Thanks again to all of you for joining. Thanks again, Rose and Diana. We look forward to being in touch.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Salim, and
Wonderful.
everybody. Thank you. Have a good
Okay.
Bye.
Yes. Take care. Bye-bye.